Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Please come right in. Come right on in. It's great to see you. Come on in. Hi, everyone. Oh, that's nice. My name is Jocelyn McDougall, and I am a facilitator and a convener and a strategist, and I work with the Tech We Want. And I want to make sure I get our byline correct here. The Tech We Want is a responsible innovation network for tech visionaries building alternative economies rooted in shared power and prosperity. And it is my great joy to be facilitating our conversation this afternoon. Now, to begin with, I really want to encourage us to move into this, like, let's fill in the inner circle. Yeah. Like, move on up. I know, oh God, why is she making us do this? I'm gonna tell you right now, this is not the most awkward thing I'm gonna have you do today. So just like, this is chill. We are gonna have a chill time. We're gonna have a chit chat. What we're doing here, you might be wondering, like, what a weird setup we have here. It is going to be different from your typical panel. But don't worry, that's the point. I'm gonna talk more about that in a moment. I wanted to start us off in a good way by acknowledging the land that we're on. So I come from the land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, which is also known as Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And where I'm from, to start ourselves in a good way, we want to acknowledge the people who have come before us, who have stewarded the land where we find ourselves. So we find ourselves today gathering and conversing on the land of the Ute people. And many other nations have come through and have gathered on these lands over the past several thousand years. So we are in very good company. We want to pay our respect and our gratitude to the elders of these nations, both past, present, and emerging, for the stewardship of these lands. And part of acknowledging the land, of course, is a move towards recognizing and telling the truth about the place where we find ourselves. But the other thing I love about a land acknowledgement is that we remind ourselves that people have been gathering here and have been having conversations that have been inviting different perspectives for literally thousands of years. And this land, this beautiful mountainous land, can hold anything. Anything that we bring to it today, this land can hold us. So I just want to name that and invite us into being in that energy of being held by these lands. I am going to pass it over to my friend and colleague Nicole in just a second to tell us a little bit about the conversation we're going to have today. But when I come back, I'm going to tell you all a little bit more about why we're sitting in this configuration before we get rolling. Nicole, take it away.
Thank you, my love. Hi, everyone, and sorry for, I feel bad about having my back to you, but there's love, okay? Hi, I'm Nicole Allred from a Media Network, and I just want to kind of lay the groundwork for us a little bit here for this conversation. So we're in the middle of a cultural shift, and it's something that we should really be paying attention to. And I think because you're all in the room and you know what this is about, you want to pay attention to it. So for over like a decade, I think, we've really had pop culture where it's really worshipped tech founders. You know, we had the Social Network film, which I was looking up what year it came out, and I was like, oh gosh, we're old, or I'm old. But it came out back in 2010. The Social Network had us thinking about this lone genius working from his bedroom, building empires from a dorm room. And disruption was the name of the game, right? Move fast and break things was what everyone needed to do, is the mantra. I lived near Silicon Valley at the time, and I remember developers were literally gods. Like, they were the people you needed to have on your teams, they were paid more, like they were everything. And then something kind of shifted. In 2022, we had the Dropout with the Theranos scandal. We had We Crashed. We had the Anna Delvey movie, and I think there was this sort of shift into this notion of, oh, things maybe aren't as they seem. And we were talking about this before, and you were saying that maybe it started with the Fire Festival, which, I mean, we all remember that. It's like, oh, the things that were being shown maybe aren't as they seem. And so now in 2026, we're starting to move more into this reckoning. The Social Network sequel is coming out, which is called The Social Reckoning, which is all about the whistleblower. And there's been so many whistleblower biopics. And so we're really in this sort of scrutiny phase. But even with all of these stories and the shows and the topics and the messages, what I keep coming back to is that actually this is really about power. These stories are really about power. Who has it, who doesn't have it, whose stories are being told, what stories actually have the power to inspire others. And I'll say, like, we know none of this is happening in a vacuum. We haven't made this switch by themselves. I think if there's anything we know in 2026 is that everything is connected, right? We have workers across industries that are feeling less security than ever, especially, I remember as well TikTok videos where we saw big tech companies and employees being laid off, like in the TikTok videos. AI is really reshaping what it looks like to make a living, especially for creatives. And there's this growing recognition, though, that the stories that we tell don't just reflect power, they actually have the ability to shape it. And there's an opportunity here, right, especially for the folks in these spaces. There's a reason that people wanted to become astronauts after watching Star Trek. There's a reason that Top Gun came out and Navy recruitment literally increased. What we see on screen literally creates possibilities for what we think can happen in our own lives. And so that's what we're here to dig into. And one question that I had was, what happens if we tell different stories, though? Not just about the leaders or not just about the singular. What if we tell stories about the collective? Ocean's 11 for me comes to mind because I love that movie. And I remember being so stunned at how everyone had their jobs. They came together and they were bigger than the sum of their parts. And so what if we made that shared power feel as inevitable as tech disruption once did? And so that's what we're here to dig into. And I think with that, I'll hand it back over to the wonderful Jocelyn. Oh, thank you.
Let's give it up for Nicole. Always give it up for Nicole. All right, everyone. So we're going to have this conversation today about power and about shifting power and distributing power through storytelling. So that's why we've chosen this setup. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this. This setup, we call it a fishbowl. And these are the fish. And you are the bowl, right? Okay. And the whole purpose of this setup is so that we can have a participatory conversation. Our invited guests are really brilliant. I want to take a little sidestep here and say, we want to give love to Lynn Renee Maxey, who was our third panelist, who is just very unwell today. And she is super rad, and she was deeply involved in all of our prep, and we love her very much. But she, at the very last possible second, had to step away. So sorry to Lynn. But our other fantastic invited guests, one of whom is an intimate social dance partner, teacher, one of whom is a budding mycologist, and one of whom takes people who have never been to the mountains to ski and snowboard in the mountains. And I'll let you guess who is who. But we're going to start off with a bit of a conversation that does feel a little bit more like a typical panel, where we're going to kind of get some inspirational talk from our invited guests here. And then we're going to move into the kind of audience participation. We're going to spend the majority of our time doing that. So once we've had our kind of introduction from this group, we're going to actually start by inviting you to sort of turn to your neighbor and have a bit of conversation just right where you are in the room. And then we're going to move into this fishbowl format. And here's how it works. Once we move into the fishbowl, and I'll let you know when it's time, anyone in the room can come up and sit down and become part of this conversation. And the way that we'll run it is that we want to always have 4 people in the center and 1 empty chair, so that at any time somebody can come and sit in the empty chair. And when that happens, someone who is one of these 4 opts to leave. And that person might leave because they've been in the circle the longest. They might leave because they've already said a lot. They might leave because they feel complete. But one of the 4 will leave, so that we collectively maintain a group of 4 people in the middle, and people keep transitioning in and out. And that way, the hope is that we end up with a really robust and nuanced conversation about how we tell different stories about power in the tech sector. Let me check my notes so I haven't missed an important detail. Please come on in. Come on in.
Jocelyn,
Welcome.
I can just say a word, actually.
I wish
just
you would.
the reason that we're doing this as well is because I feel like with traditional panels, we have like Q&A at the end and people ask incredible questions and I'm like, I want to hear more from you. And so this is a way for us to collectively hear all of the wisdom in the room. So it's chill, don't feel scared. It's going to be good, but just wanted to say a word on, it's so important that we hear from you all. So.
I'll also mention the basket of snacks in the middle of the fishbowl. So this is part of the like incentive. If you come and sit in the living room, you can have a snack. The reason why the snacks are there is that our panelists did not have breakfast or lunch. So they will definitely be snacking throughout. Like, we're just going to keep it all chill here, okay? Crunching away, having some water, having a chat. Okay, the other thing that I wanted to offer us before we move into it is, in order for this fishbowl conversation to work, a lot of us don't know each other, right? Like, we're sort of strangers. So I wanted to offer some community practices for us that we can sort of keep in mind in order to try to enable this conversation to be as robust and as nuanced as it can be. The first one I want us to think about is listen for understanding. Listen for understanding. And by that I mean we have people from very different backgrounds, different walks of life, different experiences, and it's that difference that's going to give us the most rich conversation possible. However, if we are in conversation and all we're doing while we're talking to someone is thinking about our reply and thinking about what we're going to say, then it can really make the conversation feel a little stilted, and you know what I mean? So we really want to be listening to each other so that we can be in the same conversation together. Listen for understanding. The second one I want to offer is trust the wisdom in the room. Welcome, please. Come on over, baby. Trust the wisdom of the room. So what do I mean by this? So it mayhaps that you decide, ooh, I have a question, that I have a thing I want to say, I'm going to go sit in the center. And then by the time you have an opportunity to speak, the conversation may have moved on. It might have gone to a different place. That's okay. If you've been listening for understanding, then you will have something else relevant to contribute. And maybe that thing that you were thinking about or had a question about will come back later. Or maybe somebody else will ask that question or take you there, right? So it's really trusting in the process and trusting in the wisdom in the room. The other thing I want to encourage you is think about coming into the circle even if you do not have something to say. Think about joining the conversation just to be in the conversation rather than necessarily having to have a point or have a question, right? So you can really join at any time. The third one I want to offer, so the first one is listen for understanding. The second is trust the wisdom of the room. The third one is take space, make space. I use this in facilitation a lot, and typically it's metaphorical, but today it is very literal. So this is really about having an awareness of how much space you take up in a room. Please, come on in. How much space you take up in the conversation. So if you have not taken up any space yet, get in there. Let's go. Like, take a step, take a plunge, take a leap, jump in the pool. I don't know. These metaphors are going sideways, but you know what I'm saying. Like, get into it. If you feel like you've said a thing, if you feel like you've taken up some space, then make some space for other people. And if you're in the center, maybe it's time to leave the center, etc. Right? So listen for understanding, trust the wisdom of the room, take space, make space. Are these practices that we can, and I call them practices very deliberately because nobody's perfect all the time, we're only ever practicing. But are these practices that we can try together to try to make this conversation work? Yeah. Can everybody give me some kind of visible signal? Yes, great, okay, fantastic. I think we're ready. Let's start with our inspirational beginning, and then we'll go from there. Go for it, Nicole.
Okay, all right. Let's just start by going around to our wonderful thought starters. So I want you to tell us who you are, what you do, and then I want you to think about one other thing as you introduce yourself. So we're discussing this swing, right, from worshipping tech founders to putting them sort of more on trial. But again, this is more about power. Who has it, who's losing it, who never had it to begin with. So from your particular vantage point, why do you think this shift is happening now in our current moment? Who wants to start?
I can start.
Hey.
Hi, I'm Meredith Levine. I'm a fanthropologist. Yes, that is what it sounds like. I do audience development research and strategy work, specifically with an emphasis on fans, fan culture, fandom, and participatory practices online. So that is who I am. That is why I'm here. And when I'm thinking about power and this power shift, the lens I think about is fandom, and I think about the whole history of this. And fans have always been making fan works. And I think what's happening now is we have these new tools that I'm sure Avril will get into, but we have these new tools for organization and conversation. And as internet and platforms have evolved, fandom has moved from the back burner to a little bit more of the forefront of pop culture conversation. And this has been true not just in fandom, but in subculture and community. When there are public gathering places, it means that you can join conversations and watch people gather. And it has taken several communities from being underground by necessity and safety. In my line of work, that would be transformational fans who make fan vids and write fan fiction and things like that, where it used to be in by fan for fan spaces by design, because the legal infrastructure of Hollywood made it impossible to have that work in public. But now we're seeing spaces like Wattpad has introduced monetization, which means more people are incentivized to participate. You have YouTube and TikTok, again, with monetization and incentive to participate in public rather than in private. And you have social spaces like Threads, or formerly Twitter, and these other places where people can actually meet. And I say meet because that's a caveat, but like can have these experiences of collective in a new way. And the means of production has also gotten less expensive. So not only can people consume stories in a different way, but also it is much more accessible to speak. And underserved markets serve themselves, and they find each other, and they're speaking, and now they get to speak more loudly.
Thank you. Avriel.
Thank you so much for that. Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Avriel Epps. I'm a computational social scientist, a professor at the University of California, Riverside, where I study the impact of AI, machine learning, on humans and how we develop throughout our lifespan. I also run a nonprofit organization called AI for Abolition, where we're trying to build power with and around artificial intelligence, specifically with marginalized communities. And the way that I'm also a content creator, so we will probably get into those tensions around how content creators and platforms exist together. When I think about this shift in narrative around power and technology, I like that we opened with thinking about what the stories we were telling about these people in the early aughts, the 2010s. And I think the first break in that facade, culturally, had to do with Cambridge Analytica and the 2016 election. Right? That was when we first saw, oh shit, these are not like these neutral new playgrounds for us. They said that we were going to democratize media. And in fact, they data mined all of us and stripped a lot of our political power. And it seems like it's just been getting worse since then. I think the narrative now has a lot to do with the rise in inequality, political instability globally, and mental health crisis that the world, but especially this country and Western countries, are facing. And many people look at those three things. Oh, we can also talk about climate change as kind of the fourth aspect in this polycrisis. Many people look at those four things and say, the tech industry has a lot to do with all of those. And if we follow the money and the incentives, even if it's a conversation just about corporate power and corporations, well, who are the 7 biggest corporations in the world? Right? So it doesn't take a huge mental leap for people to say, those guys seem to have started some really big problems that we're now all being forced to reckon with, while we are also now under the threat of increased surveillance. So anyway, I'll stop talking there. But that's the shift from my vantage point.
No, and that's perfect. And this is all fodder for you all to like start coming in eventually. I guess since we're shifting and we don't have our wonderful third panelist, I will sort of be in that spot. But so as I said, I'm Nicole Allred, and I lead our culture and narrative change work at Media Network. And when I think about the answer of why now, I think there's a lot of, kind of following up from what you're saying, there's a lot of just questioning of systems that are already in place. And I think particularly with storytelling, AI has opened a lot of doors for, I think, people to enter into the Hollywood system that they could not approach before. And when I've been talking to creators, I spoke to this incredible musician who was like, no, he made this really great album, like an AI, like visual album. And it was about his Nigerian American heritage. And there's this beautiful video that he makes, and he's like, I would never have been able to get anyone to fund me to make this. And now it's out there and it's creating impact. And for him, he's like, I'm getting into this space that I wasn't able to get into before. I also speak to creators and film writers and directors who are like, absolutely not. I will never use this AI as part of my creative process. It's not for me. And so I think, and there's some in between as well. There's some people who are like, I'm not sure. I really believe that if we don't take part in this, then the tech companies will sort of impose it on us, right? We need to be part of steering it so that we have a say. So I feel like I'm here for there's no binaries, right? And some people believe all of those things in one. And so when I think about why now, I'll go back to that questioning of the systems. You know, who does the system serve? Who is being kept out of it? Who is protecting the power that they've always had? And who is having power for the first time? And also, how do we ensure that people who have worked really hard to create music and cartoons and art in their own image, you know, and the images that they specifically have the style of doing, you know, I think about Studio Ghibli, like how do we ensure that we're protecting that as well? And so there's many things. So I'll pause there. And then I'll move back into my moderator space and say, when we think about, if we're thinking, okay, we have what's broken, right? Like we know the system that's kind of broken. But I think when we go back to this notion when we started of the stories that center the founder and whether we are worshiping them or whether we are sort of scrutinizing them, it's still about these people. It's still about one person. It's still about Holmes. It's still about Zuckerberg. We're still watching their story. But I guess I'd say, how do we get off of this pendulum altogether, right? There's so many other people who make that possible. What does it take to make stories about collective power, about working people, just like regular people, about communities? Again, the Ocean's 11 comes to mind. And building these alternatives. How do we make that feel relevant, possible, doable? Maybe we'll start with you, Meredith.
Income equality. I think a lot of this has to do with the tech founder narrative is an aspirational narrative. The unicorn narrative of venture capital is an aspirational narrative of being able to escape velocity into social upward mobility. And I think that is one of the systemic flaws. And I see this in the creator economy a lot too, is like you can have a creative career in this industry because it is less gatekept than other versions of industry, and it's less gatekept all the way down because in 2008 through 2012 on YouTube, YouTubers had the benefit of being in college, having access to the materials, and they wanted to work in television. And then TikTok came along, and oftentimes it's, well, YouTube has critical mass, and it's a different skill set, and the cost of entry is still high, relatively speaking. And so TikTok enabled a different medium to come in to create a career. But I think a lot of it has to do with being able to have a sustainable career in the arts. So I think this has to do with union labor. Also, I did a report for a client a few years back about the state of blue-collar jobs and who's portraying the jobs that we have career gaps for in America. And it's not Hollywood. It's people who actually have those jobs telling their own stories. So on TikTok, you can find plumbers and handymen and people who are solar power installers and millennials who said, F this life, moved to France, bought a dilapidated chateau, and are renovating it themselves one step at a time. Like, you can find all of that because people are telling their own stories, and it's a lot harder in systems where writers need to write what they know, and the system of getting to be in a writer's room already is challenging for people who maybe come from backgrounds where those perspectives are more what we need to be seeing and more collective. It is just a different path to get into the spaces, to even be eligible to be chosen to be on television or to have theatrical distribution. So, I mean, I think that is part of the problem of how do we get more of these stories that are collective. I was talking with Amber and Amanda on Wednesday about the power of the ensemble cast and why ensemble cast is really good for fandom. And ensemble cast is really good for fandom because you get multiple perspectives and people can identify with whomever they want and whomever feels good to them, and there's more opportunity for more direct forms of representation where you don't necessarily have to have giant leaps to get there. So I think that's also part of it, is thinking about showcasing perspective, and then if you don't have that perspective, find people to help you get that perspective in the storytelling. But mostly I think it's income inequality.
Can you say, just follow-up question, when in our prep calls you were talking about how it's human nature to always want to see upward mobility and to always want to see people doing better than you because we can see a dream or have a dream for ourselves.
Yeah.
Is that something that we always need? Like, are they the kind of stories that we have to have?
Yeah, I think utopian thinking. So I grew up as a baby fangirl in the era of dystopian franchises with female heroines. Yeah, I consumed a lot of that in my youth. But also, I grew up in relative peacetime. Like, I was a teenager in the Obama administration. That was a different time in America where culture could be different. And when I look around today at what's going on, and when I think back in the history of film and television, I think about utopian spaces of Star Trek Next Generation, of Gilmore Girls, of Ted Lasso, of romance as a genre where it's not necessarily fantasy, but it is socio-emotional fantasy, of imagining a world of being seen and heard and understood by somebody else and finding love, and everyone suddenly has all these communication skills that like we're all missing as real people, and like there really is, if you can see it, you can be it culture. It's been studied in the medical field with the impact of Grey's Anatomy on women who go to med school. And so I do think it's really important from a creative perspective to build a world you want people to live in so that people can say, I want to live here, and reverse engineer it.
Ariel, your take. I want you to answer that. I also want you to bring in the pushback, I guess, against billionaires. Because I think always, right? Maybe it's always been there. Maybe we've always been against billionaires, but I think it's never been so loud. And so bring that in, right? Like when we're thinking about these stories, when we're thinking about how we get off of the pendulum, bring in, of course, your work with on like building communities and building content as well. But how do you think the element of billionaires comes in? I mean, I know you spoke to me about how there's so many more of us than there are of billionaires, and speak to that a little bit and kind of bring that in for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think before I get to that, there's just one other thing I want to add to the conversation that Meredith was just having, which is we also have to recognize that all of us in this room, given the culture that we grew up in, probably don't have the best skills to tell collectivist stories because we live in an individualistic society. But there are a lot of cultures all around the world that intimately understand collectivism in a way that we do not, and we can learn from them.
Hell yeah. Like, one of the things that we're seeing in the fandom spaces are cultural import from East Asia, which is inherently collectivist. And the way that fandom expresses over there is much more like joining a union. It is collective action to a goal. If you've ever encountered what BTS Army can do, if you've ever especially what they did in terms of buying tickets to Trump rallies and ghosting and there's a lot of yes, and I think we're seeing it being imported at a scale that we haven't before, and it has been in fandom since the 80s of people mailing VHSs and converting them from one international format to a format that's consumable in the United States, and but it's been really underground, and now it's Netflix is actively buying K-drama.
Totally. So yeah, I think it's important to remember that we don't know everything there is to know about telling stories as Westerners. And we have things to learn from the global South and also from the East. So on the topic of billionaires and collective power, we were talking about this kind of in the intro about when this narrative starts to shift. And one thing I think I failed to mention was just kind of the capital grab and the upward transfer of wealth that we saw in the pandemic. And the boom in billionaires that happened from that time until now. And it seems maybe if you don't think about it that deeply, that billionaires have a lot of power, right? They're in control of our modes of communication. They have huge say in what happens in our government, et cetera, et cetera. But there's fewer than 3,000 of them in the world. So just by sheer numbers, there are a whole hell of a lot more of us. And I don't just mean us, everybody who's not a billionaire. I mean us, people who politically believe that billionaires should not exist. And there is, by orders of magnitude, right? There is also a scrappiness, a creativity, a I would say even maybe through desperation to move the needle in some way. We had an upper advantage. Of course, they have the upper advantage of mass surveillance and automated weaponry and defense contracts and all of that stuff. But we have to keep reminding ourselves that there are way more of us than there are of them. And hopefully, for me, that gives me a lot of hope in the power of community organizing, because it means I only have to speak to, I speak to that many people, orders of magnitudes more people than there are billionaires on my TikTok on a daily basis, right? So important to remember.
And follow up to that, you've built these communities online to make AI feel really accessible and approachable. I think there's definitely a narrative that says, I'm not an AI expert, I'm not a tech expert, I don't get to have a say. And that's something that we're actually trying to push back on, and I think you do that with the communities that you build online. But there's kind of a tension between the short form and long form and the creator economy. How do you think about sort of that responsibility, I guess, when you're creating that content? What drives it, particularly for these communities? And speaking of that scrappiness and...
Yeah. I feel less of a tension between short form and long form in my work, although I hope somebody else will come sit in the circle and talk about that. For me, it feels more about the tension of participating in a platform while critiquing a platform. That's the tension. I talk a lot about tech refusal. I don't call it that because I'm trying to speak to a 6th grade reading level, but I talk about it in terms of you could switch your email provider and that'd be one less dollar you're giving to Google every day, And if enough of us do that, maybe we can, at the very least, when if law enforcement ever needs to subpoena your emails, they won't be able to if you switch it to the right email provider. You know what I mean? But that conversation about tech refusal on the platforms feels challenging, and I don't have a good answer for that yet. I will say that this idea that the majority of Americans read at or below, and comprehend at or below a 6th grade reading level drives a lot of my strategy. It's why I wrote a kid's book about AI bias rather than like a grown-up book about AI, because I care more that parents and working people with kids and grandparents with grandchildren learn about these things. And I know that they're not going to be sitting in a college classroom doing that. And I approach making content in the same way. Yeah.
Thank you. This feels like a good time. You've joined us in the circle, Jocelyn. So this feels like a good time to hand back to you, and you'll keep us going.
I'd love to.
Oh, thanks.
Great. Okay, so just do a little shimmy.
We'll just shimmy in the middle.
Okay. We might be starting a secret sorority of progressive tech women. If you want to join, you just have to do a little shimmy, and then you're in. Cute outfits.
Absolutely.
Babe, if you come like that, you're in. You're good. Okay, all right, okay. So we've started off, we've talked about, we've reviewed this sort of idea that we've had this pendulum swing, right? We've had this pendulum swing where we used to laud and worship these founders, and now there's this reckoning happening. We've started to talk a little bit about what does it take to tell stories that are not even part of that pendulum, that get away from that dichotomy. And that's the conversation that we want to continue to have with the rest of the room for the rest of the afternoon. So in order to do that, we're actually going to start by inviting you to talk to each other. So we're going to go for like 6 or 7 minutes. Just turn to your neighbor. And we want you to answer the question, when was the last time, because part of the, finish the framing. Part of what we're trying to get at is, what are the other stories that we might be wanting to tell? Who should be telling those stories? How do those stories get made? And will people actually want to consume them? And so to that end, we want to invite you to turn to your neighbor right now and talk about, when was the last time you watched something that moved you to action or made you feel like you were part of something? When was the last time you watched something that moved, anything, that moved you to action or made you feel like you were part of something? And what was it about that thing that made you feel that way? Okay, so we're gonna go for, I'll let you know, but just like turn to 1 or 2 neighbors and have this chat, and then we'll move into the sort of next fishbowl component, okay? What is something that you've watched recently that made you feel moved to action or made you feel part of something, and what was it about it that made you feel that way? Go for it.
I can't wait to watch it. I'm hoping to actually get some episodes in this week.
I hope you are. I really do. It's only 6 episodes. Episode 3 is a day 6 episodes. It's only 6 episodes. Episode 3 is a major turning point. And this is a normal fan experience to have a magic community for shared consumption. I came up with a question and I was magic community for your fandom. I think to action to stop thinking of sports as a hobby. So we can create action in that way.
Yeah. What's so funny is that, like, I just heard Nicole say, like, I thought of this question, I don't even know my answer, and I was also feeling that way until you just said that, because the thing that I have watched recently that has made me feel that way is the WTA. I'm obsessed. Obsessed. And I feel like, and I mean, I've watched a lot. I've been around a lot of sports on television for my life because my parents were doing this. So like I've watched a lot of sports television. But for me, what I feel like is awesome about the W is that I actually think there's storytelling that's happening. Like, and I think there probably is in other sports too, right?
I think like car storytelling because people are married to their partners.
Also that, but also like I care about the characters. There's characters. There's rivalries, and there's like whatever, right? And like, but also there's stories like, for example, Valkyrie, right? This kind of fucking underdog story, like this ragtag bunch of misfits with a brand new team that never existed before. They have the first and only like Asian action league, and she like, and they went to the fucking house. Like no one thought they had a goddamn chance in hell, and then they like rose up and like, you know, we're a band of misfits, and it was so great.
What does it mean? So like this is one of the reasons why like PHL is really because WNBA is
I don't know. I fell down a rabbit hole one day. And I'm like,
right.
okay, right. I didn't know that.
So
I mean, wow.
yeah,
And we've been doing it for like under $1,000. And so I'm like, yeah, because like I'm now pretty much
I never actually like so I like that. And now I'm talking about how like billionaires understand socialism because of the way that like NHL draft picks cap tables salaries and like how they actually understand fairness and competition when they're all in together and together as a block. Like it's mostly walking was the white dogs.
Yeah, I
know. Like from like the Packers and AFC Cincinnati. Yes.
Yes.
Like something else. So like I don't want to
But also it becomes, that was the thing for me as like W is that I never gave a shit about basketball, ever in a million years. But all of a sudden I now actually like give a shit about what's going on in the court because I give a shit about what's going on off the court.
Right. Yeah. And so like, yeah, it's I think it's really important. I think it's really important that we do this in this way because sports has been the fan battle and perspective.
Yes. We should have a whole fucking panel about this, but yeah.
And so like,
so when we come to the second half of this question, which is what is it about? So what is it about heated rivalry? What is it about my experience with the W or PWHL, whatever, that makes us feel part of something or makes us feel moved to action? Like, what is it about the way that story is told? What is it about what happened in that story? What is it about anything about that story that made you feel like this?
oh, so many things. One is technologically, it's technically great from like a cemetery perspective from the sound engineer perspective. It's technologically great, but also every kind of conflict that shows up, it's never interpersonal, like they go with each other. It's like them versus patriots, and they're facing it together. And whenever someone oftentimes the issue is anxiety versus reality, and it's when you address your anxiety, the reality is more checked.
Like people unintentionally anxiety when they are resharing the like new terrible things that you're talking about. And you're be talking about it is like
to have the vulnerability of like just a firefighter's job or like
now this is not our story that has done that, but what is it about this story that you think that makes that message land in a different way? For you specifically.
like I think it's the first contemporary that I've been interested in. And it's like because I think I can't make sense of like this judge. I can't trust her profession. She's highlighting like all the circumstances.
Yeah.
Instead of shining a light on how they're trying to get us there, she's like, I think that is but look at the numbers right now. You know, and like there are so many factors that make it sections of those videos are very expensive to shoot. And also intellectually, I get to be a person who I get to be a body person and I get to be a creative chart. It's a multifaceted experience in my life.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I feel like for me with the WNBA, for me the very first thing, like the thing that like really got me in was that it was as a woman who grew up in the like 80s and early 90s, like I was a teenager in the 90s, and there were no depictions of women that looked like that. None. Zero. Like the Olympics a little bit, do you know what I mean? But like exactly right. And before Alone Mar, there was fucking nothing. You know, there was Martina Navratilova, you know, there was Steffi Graf, but there was not like the like cornucopia, the rainbow of different kinds of women that exist, and the way that a woman can be powerful, competitive, ambitious, and you know, like also an asshole, also really great. Yes. Kick the shit out of each other. Exactly right. And so like that was the first, it was like feeling like this little Jocelyn. It was like, I wish that my younger self could see these examples of what it can mean to be a woman. Yeah, totally. And so I feel like
Yeah, like that's the part that kind of made me. I mean, I'm not out these streets being like, I think it's a WNBA, like it's not that kind of thing. But but speaking of a fandom, like, and also the fandom is so fucking queer. There's so many hot queer ladies like that. So part of it for me,
That's right. Just imagine, like, I get to go to WNBA or when I'm in soccer commercials in LA House, but like people go and like I don't know, like sports is that's there.
yeah, dude, it's so great. And then they go around and they fucking show all the little kids, all the little girls in the stadium, like little fucking girls with the signs that are like, I'm gonna be in the W. It's I like have cried. I have cried in that. Okay, all right. Are we good? How long have you been going? I have no idea. I'm like getting really. I know. Me too. Okay. Okay, so I'm taking this shit over. All right, everyone. All right, everybody. Talking about our favorite stories. All right, my friends. Oh, we just had a real good conversation, and I was talking about the WNBA, y'all, and I just think that we should have a whole other series about that, a whole other. So if you want to have a panel about the W, we can talk about it in the lounge after. Yes. Do you know that this woman is the official photography of the Valkyries? Okay, she's a big deal. She's a big deal. Chloe, we love you. I'm so jealous. When are you gonna take me into the?
Somebody asked me, but that was amazing to watch. Y'all just rocked it.
Yeah, all the people want to talk. All right.
2 seconds and y'all just.
So now we're gonna return to the fishbowl, and so this was sort of like the conversation you just had was sort of the seed, right? I'm gonna get out of the way here. We're gonna move into the fishbowl, and as I discussed for anyone who joined late, we're gonna take up space. We're gonna come on into the middle. We're gonna join in the middle. We're going to try to keep 4 people in the center at all times, so when somebody else comes and takes the 5th seat, someone who's already in the circle is going to leave, and we're just going to cycle through. And so the question, so I'm going to seed this next segment of the conversation with a question. This is something that Nicole and I have devised. But from there, it's really on you. The conversation will go where you take it, okay? And so to move forward, we want to talk about. Wait, what am I doing here? Sorry. Let me check my notes. Well, I'm going to make up the question because I thought I wrote it down, but I didn't. But where I want us to go is what I was talking about before we dropped into this question, right? Which is, what are these other stories? Because ultimately, what we're interested in, what we've been thinking about and trying to talk about is, how do we tell stories about tech? How do we tell stories about tech that are not just about the founder? How do we tell stories about tech that do not make tech inevitable? That the future of tech is inevitable, right? We all, and people like us, have the capacity to contribute to and shape the future of tech. And so part of what we're going for here is, what are the kinds of stories that we can tell that help us think about collective power, that help us think about agency? And I think, and we think, that part of the answer to that is what moves us. Right? What are the characteristics of the stories that you were just talking about with one another, about what moves us, right? How do we make these stories sexy? So what are the stories? Who should be telling them? How should they get made? Like, what are the conditions under which they get made? And also, how do we make them sexy? Like, how do we make them so that collective power, for example, is the next disruption? Right? So that's the sort of seed that I want to invite for the next set of the conversation. Do we have one intrepid person who might be willing? Yes, get into it. I love it. Get into it. Okay. Can I have your name? Anu. That's for you. Perfect. Okay, so Anu is joined, and now at any time, anyone else can come and sit in the 5th chair, and then someone else will leave, and then we'll continue to. And so unless this whole thing goes really wildly sideways, you're just going to go, and we're going to do this for probably at least 30 minutes, maybe 35. So Anu, kick us off.
So I'm really inspired today because I've just, you guys have just jogged a memory. The first year I was here at Sundance was 23. I met a black filmmaker who said she had made her feature film on $25,000. And I came out of film school with this entitlement that I probably did not acknowledge. And 3 years on, having made a feature film myself for far less, I kind of see her to be the first whisper into the wind. And one of my creative goals this year was to break the monolith. So to answer you about, is the dream necessary? I was just sharing with my friends in the back that for a person like me, or coming from a country like mine, and I have several entitlements that I'm very openly acknowledging just to be here, but it's very hard to be sold on the dream of a beauty queen. You know, once you subscribe to that, you're finished. And so today I don't know, I'm really happy today because I just feel that you asked, who is to tell the story and how do we tell it? I think we are the story, and the quicker we recognize it, the better. And also, how do you make it sexy? You just scale up and speak to Tamil filmmakers as much as you can and break things. So that's what I think. And yeah, thank you for the space.
Yeah, we are so much cooler than them. Like, just across the board. I'm sorry, Mark Zuckerberg, I'm like 10 times hotter than him. Right. But anyway. And so are you.
Yes.
Accurate.
So when you think about budget and creating what you can with what you have, how did that factor into like your process and your narrative and your idea of what the story is going to tell? From the creator economy, this is how it grew. It was kids in college with time because they were in college, with money because with time because they were in college, and with resources because they had webcams, doing what they can with what they have. As a filmmaker, how do you think doing what you can with what you have in terms of production contributes to this cause?
So I think the downside of maybe being amongst filmmakers is also that we become hyper aware of the things that are not so trendy. Like if you say, I'm going to shoot this on an iPhone, there'll be 10 size of giving up, or you're considered to be giving up, or whatever the case may be. And just to answer what you've asked me, like I'm an engineer turned filmmaker, unfortunately, but I feel there are 10,000 people who contribute to that code base, and none of them are acknowledged except the person at the top. And 3 years on, I think what I see is to tell my little girl that you can't do what you want to do just for lack of money or access. That seems defeatist, because we are also plugging the thought that filmmaking is very democratic. It really isn't, but we're plugging that thought. So it's for us to sort of show what can be done. And so this year, I think the only thing that changed, last year, was being able to lean into the original thought of do what you can with what you have. Because the stories that inspired me, because I started film after I had children. And nobody said you can do this. Nobody ever said to any mother you can do this. And so for me, it just became about leaning into what felt urgent and very like if I had no other choice but to do it. And I think that voice mutes itself if you're too much out there, reading too much or buying into the utopian. I love that. I think you need mileposts, of course. But I also see the danger of it over time. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, it reminds us, we talked about moving away from suffering and moving towards joy in some of our prep, and how both of that is really important to be able to highlight the problems and also imagine solutions.
Right.
I was just going to share that in our conversation, I was talking about Stranger Things. Is there anyone who likes Stranger Things in here? Yeah, any Stranger Things fans? Okay. Because for me, the storyline, there's one kid who has, no spoilers, but there's one kid who has way more power inside of him than he realized, and it's kind of revealed at the last minute. And I thought about other stories that, like Matrix, I was always super into the Matrix and Neo and how he had this latent power. And so when you're talking, I'm thinking as well about like these stories, especially in Stranger Things, it's not just about one person's power. It's about everybody's power, and they come together and they make the thing. And so what you were saying just really resonates. I'm going to leave now because you joined.
I'm here now. Wow. Okay. Well, actually, I felt like compelled to join because like I'm hearing that like you were introducing yourselves and you were talking about children. Like you wrote a children's book. You know, you're talking about your little girl. You're talking about growing up as a teenager and like in fandom and such. And so like I'm curious for you know, for all of you and maybe you know someone else in this room too. Like, what are the stories you might want to tell, like, today's children? And, you know, like, what are the stories that we need for, like, for children? And you know, how do you tell those things? And I'm like, you know, you did the thing. And, like, what are you thinking next?
Yeah, I'm about to get up, though, because we had somebody. But I'll just briefly say, like, that is the thing that I'm constantly thinking about. Like, how can what am I doing today in my work and my life that's going to allow my child and his peers to inherit a better future? And that is thinking about the joy and not the suffering. I mean, there's two sides of that coin, right? Like joy and suffering are the same coin. But it is inspiring and motivating when we think about what moves us, like keeping that in my brain. That is what moves me and what makes me feel compelled emotionally to do this really difficult, both emotionally, intellectually, physically, et cetera, work.
I want to address the children's media thing also. If you were here for Pull Focus, there's a woman named Liz Hara who works at Sesame Street. If you're here later, she'll be talking about Sesame Street. And this is like a lot of core fandom memory comes from youth culture. A lot of people's first introductions to feelings of belonging outside of an immediate family happen through mediated environments and fandom. And I think that there are some really great examples of children's media today that aren't just for children. If you asked me today what my favorite fandom is, it's different. But if you had asked me 6 months ago, I would have said adult fans of Bluey without children. Because of the socio-emotional skill building and development. And I think this is something that Sesame Street does. And I think I think we got into this STEM place of glorifying tech founders because we got into glorifying STEM, because this is where upward mobility and employment was. And I think that when we think about what do we want to teach children, I think it's kindness. I think it's socio-emotional skill building. I think it's how do you apologize and forgive. I think it's like, how do you add age-appropriate levels, which, as it turns out, like, full disclosure, I'm 37 and I still read YA, like, because those coming-of-age narratives are still important because it talks about a person in progress, and that's part of what I think is important. And I'm gonna, okay, great.
I have thoughts. No, but you joined first.
I think a lot of what I'm hearing here, it has a lot to do with values. And I'm very cautious about cognitive distortions, particularly dichotomous thinking, us versus them. I believe that, you know, there's a lot of frustration that is essentially expressed towards the billionaires and the tech founders. And I understand where that comes from, but one thing we have to ask ourselves is we didn't choose, they're not our representatives, right? Billionaires are individuals who have taken advantage of a system that we've all sort of bought into. It's a shared social construct, and that system has rewarded them for their ingenuity. And the real issue is what's the governance, what's our legal and our governance and our, what's our way of curtailing that? And what are the incentives, right? Because we have to also recognize that capitalism has been responsible probably more than any other social construct for lifting people out of abject poverty than any other form of control. I'm from Nigeria, and I can tell you that technology has done tremendous impact on perception, changing narrative. A young African who is 13 today doesn't have to worry about changing the perception. It's sort of implicit that, yeah, you know Afrobeats music, or yeah, you've seen Black Panther and you understand where those cloths come from. And a lot of that has been the result of social media, TikTok, Instagram, the democratization of music and access to music through Spotify and things of that nature. So I just caution that we think of the worst case and the worst attributes of technology and capitalism and its reward and its incentive systems, and we often don't realize how much it has helped so many people. This is not to say that there should not be a referendum on its successes, but I think what we lose in our agency to cause those changes, that we focus so much on the bad that we don't allow ourselves an opportunity to, repair. Yeah.
I think that goes hand in hand with your comments around the stories that we tell children. And when I think of that, I think of the importance of actually preparing kids to understand and engage with the real world. And I think about the stories that I grew up with as a kid and the things that really inspired me. Like, these are stories that had many, many layers to them. There was like an initial layer that I could understand as a kid, and I got to learn more about the systems that those stories represented as I grew older. And like, I grew up in the 90s. Erin Brockovich was like a big movie. It was character driven, it was rich in narrative, it wasn't beating me over a head with a guilt trip about like, you can't have oil or gasoline or whatever, right? It was showing me that there are both winners in the world of like capitalism, right? But there are people who have really meaningful negative impacts that they're associated with, right? And I think about like, as we were trying to talk about what are the films that actually keep you, keep with you and change your narrative over time. These are character-driven films. They're not all documentaries. Like occasionally you'll find like a Blackfish or like My Octopus Teacher, right? Or something, and you're like, oh, this is really incredible. I'm like really deep into it, right? But when's like the last time you found one of those around like workers' rights and collective ownership? Like, the stories that I think need to be told are stories like the Battle of Bel-Air Mountain. Like, what a crazy, wild action movie would that be that exposes some of the challenges of how we see capitalism affecting us every day and the everyday heroism that it takes for individuals, not like one single person, right? But a whole collection of people who are all risking small parts of their comfort and their current identity to be able to make meaningful change in workers' rights. And if there's a narrative that like resonates with people today, I think it's that one. And I think it should come from people who lived it, who have that oral history as part of their family. And I think that if we're not paying attention to filmmakers and creators that are outside of major media hubs, I mean, I grew up here. Utah's like a wonderful place that's rich in history, and so many people could tell so many great stories. But until they've got access to funding, they're not going to. And so talking about the excesses of capitalism, right? Like, acknowledging that philanthropy can play an incredible role in not just backing documentary film production, but also this narrative-driven work through groups like Harbor and others that are starting to build philanthropic vehicles to power that, I think is a really under-discussed part of like trying to build up the narratives that we're trying to build today.
Dustin and I had a great start to this conversation over there when we were sitting next to each other about these Trojan horse narratives that maybe have an agenda hidden within, but are delivering the message through entertainment and maybe reaching the types of people who wouldn't necessarily be reached by literature or teachers or parents, and maybe they'll seek out all of the studies and data and educate themselves as a result. But sometimes it takes something like Stranger Things or an anime or a story that is just reminding you that there's a power inside you that can be channeled into something meaningful, and being able to translate that into actionable goals and connecting with community and building change. And I think it's also what you said. What's your name? Abiola. What you said about the nuances and not making it just a two-sided dichotomy is really powerful too, because I think we need to encourage young people to learn to self-regulate and examine our relationships with technology and media. And yes, the problems with tech billionaires are going to persist, and it's a testament to our future that there are great organizations, including ones of young people like Design It For Us and the work that Omidyar Network is doing, who are fighting for better legislation and duty of care laws from the people in charge of tech. But also, we need to start on the individual level and the community level and build that awareness and learn how to use it in ways that are positive and learn how to avoid the harmful effects and have peer-to-peer conversations that can, in the intersection of mental health and media usage, actually save lives when we're able to talk about that stuff. And so I think finding those stories, making them sexy, making them entertaining and accessible, and finding a way to reach all the different types of people who might be affected by these issues is a really powerful step for any creators to take.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm Amanda. I'm a filmmaker, co-founder of Fangirl Central, which is a fandom consulting company and multimedia company with my sister Amber over there. We translate and amplify fandom for intersectional fans. So when I say intersectional, we are talking about intersectionality within identity, so sexuality, race, gender, things like that, but also between fandoms, because I think as much as we segregate ourselves based on all those other types of identity, we also tend to do that as fans. You never think of a sports fan or a One Direction fangirl in the same sentence, but they can be one and the same. So just wanted to frame what I'm about to say with that. But I completely agree. I think documentaries can change people a lot, but the two that you mentioned that were very transformative were both about sea creatures and not about humans. I think that people tend to empathize with animals over people that are not like themselves. And so in that nature, stories can be the most powerful thing in the world. You empathize with a character because you get inside their head in a way that you can't with a real person. So as much as you want to empathize with someone who's a documentary subject, you can't really know them and you shouldn't really know them based on just a movie. So I did want to say that. I also came into The Circle because The Social Network is my favorite movie. And I think I completely agree with putting these tech billionaires on pedestals is not really the story to go, but I have seen The Social Network millions of times, and I think we forget that that movie is actually a cautionary tale about the dangers and how it can divorce you from your humanity from the beginning of that movie to the end. At the end, yes, you empathize with Mark, but you're kind of like, I don't want to be that guy. He loses all of his most important relationships in that movie, and I think that one could write a PhD dissertation on the fact that that movie's a love story between him and Eduardo. I'm not going to get all fangirl and say that it's romantic, but there are many different types of love stories. And the devastation of that movie lies in the complete destruction of their relationship. And Mark is a completely different person after it. But I think that it's very telling, and I think that we can all rewatch The Social Network to see why we don't want to become tech billionaires and why we should want to keep our humanity. And I think that more stories should be told from the perspective of maybe not the cautionary tale of the asshole in the center of the movie, but the people around him that he affects. So those are just my 3 cents.
I'm currently working on a docu-series about a fallen billionaire. And so I've been for the last 3.5 years very deep in this world of who are these billionaires, what are they all about? And I similar to, I think he left now, but I take a very similar position. I think sort of this us versus them is very dangerous. It creates like a really weird divide between the haves and the have-nots because it's really a huge gradient, right? There's so much gray in the middle. Just because you've got 900 million doesn't mean you've got the same mindset as one or the other. I think it's really about power. This concept of the unchecked power in capitalism is very strong in the United States. I'm from Austria. Austria is a much more collectivist society. But at the same time, collectivism is also not just a super simple answer, right? Like you look at China, and both present-day China and Mao Zedong China are two very powerful versions of collectivism that are both incredibly dangerous and incredibly murderous. So just because we've got this hardcore laissez-faire capitalism here doesn't mean that the opposite is actually the answer. And I think the real question is this regulation of power, whether it's the regulation of the power of a collectivist state or the power of a billionaire. It's about who are these people and how are they being regulated. And if we leave it all up to their own regulation, you might have people like Omidyar who does the right thing with that money, and you have people like Elon Musk who does the complete wrong thing with that money. And so I think us as a society, that's the power of the collective, is to demand laws that then regulate that unchecked power by a capitalist billionaire. And in our docuseries, there's this other layer that I think is also really important here, right? Like we're talking about a system of belief. What do we believe in, right? The United States does not believe in collectivism. Otherwise, there would be a universal healthcare system. To me, that is the ultimate sort of like litmus test. If a society has reached at least a moderate level of collectivism is when they figure out that, hey, if you have a collectivist healthcare system, that is way better for every single participant in the system except for the insurance companies. And so as long as that doesn't happen, I think a collectivist dream in the US is kind of, it's a dream, it's not a reality, right? And I think it's all these people that can work on this, whether it's in storytelling, but I think ultimately we are telling stories about individuals. That is the way that the human brain processes stories. We identify with one person or multiple people, but it's always a one-on-one relationship with us and the screen. So I think it's important to take that into consideration, that we are always looking at individual people when we identify with stories. And we can tell stories of rebels and people that rise up as individuals and then form a collective, but ultimately we'll always look at that one individual that inspires us.
I think that you can look at multiple individuals within one ensemble, though, to inspire you. With collectivism, the dangers of it, I feel like we're leaning into like collectivism versus cult behavior and just kind of mindless following people, which we have in America and which exists across a lot of different cultures. But I do think that we as people are able to empathize with multiple different people within one story. I think that's why stories like The Avengers works, or like for all the people in the audience who grew up with Barbie, like Barbie versus Bratz, for example. There's multiple girls in Bratz that you can identify with versus just one Barbie. Like if you're not thin, white, and blonde, you might be able to identify with her, but you might be able to identify with someone else a little bit more. That's why I think that ensembles are important, because you can identify with someone different each time you return to a story. And multiple different people in the audience might have different favorite characters than just the main character, especially if you have an ensemble where there's not just one main character. Because I think individualism in storytelling and the hero's journey, it's a very Western way to tell a story, but there's a lot of different ways to tell stories.
Just to go off of that too, Toby and I were speaking on during our sort of breakout session, the piece of media that we encountered that inspired us to take action. And we're both New Yorkers, and I have a friend who's on Zoran's media campaign, and one of the things that I watched that changed my mind and that brought me into action in the real world was his rollout. Starting back in fall of 24, when he went to Queens and asked people why they didn't vote for the Democrats in the presidential election, and why they voted the way they did, and watching his campaign rollout of someone who was not just a politician, but someone who appeared and was willing to appear as a New Yorker, as someone who, sorry, I get like a little emotional about it, but just because it is exciting to feel like I'm part of something bigger than myself, and something that is leading to a sense of hope and wonder and like a better life, where dignity is not something that people are like aspiring to, but that it's the baseline. And it feels so often in the United States that we're not permitted to dream bigger. And he really brought about the sense of like, no, we can just do it. We can just make it happen. And 2 weeks in, we got universal childcare in New York, and like it's a start. It's something. It's a huge step. And and to me, that sort of like matter of fact, like the ownership of our democracy and what's great about it is sexy. I think that there is a like, I'm walking down the street and one of those big LCD panels has him talking about like cold weather advisories, and like I'd never seen a mayor do that, and I was like, I didn't know that was possible, and that to me is sort of at the heart of what we're talking about when it comes to democratization and pushing back against notions of top-down control. Is one, showing what democracy is capable of and what a collective sensibility can bring, the benefits that it can bring, and this aversion to siloing and cutting people out of decision making or as I said, like dignity or group decision making.
I was just to both of your points. I think one way to inspire people about what's going on with technology and the dangers of it is to make movies that aren't about technology at all, but that remind people of the power of collective activism. And that movie inspired you. I produced a movie called Summer of Soul that Questlove directed about the Harlem Cultural Festival, and obviously that movie came out at the right time in terms of people having been inside with COVID and being reminded of the power of music, the power of community, and so just wanted to say that.
Thank you for that movie.
Facts.
Yeah, for real.
Yeah, I think we were talking about the types of stories. I think there's this untapped well of two things that we know inspire people, and that's mythology and military history. I know that sounds weird, but follow me real quick. Black Panther is essentially mythology and military history. And it's also a vision for the future, but it really taps into like this mythos of like Bast and all this other cool stuff. And then like this culture that has this really cool cultural identity. And then if you even think about Coogler's Sinners, right? You look back, everybody's scene that they talk about the most is when there's that like timeline dance through of all the different history and so on and so forth. The problem is when we think about mythology as Westerners, we tend to think of either Norse or Greek, and there's so many other types of mythologies out there. And like the movie that we talked about, well, at least me, was The Woman King. That was the story that really, really like inspired me, and I was fired up after. I couldn't talk after I left that movie. Why? And it was because you had this powerful military that was small and it was theirs, and you also had this powerful mythology that they were basing all of their actions under. And those are the type of things that inspire us, because as people, like narrative stories started off as mythology stories, right? I think if we go back to that old school understanding of things, we could really start to develop and mine for new types of stories that could actually resonate with a broader group of people and a more niche group of people, so they can see themselves in that mythos.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that, and I want to follow up on your point. And one of the things we talked about in panel prep was, and one of the things that I guess I talked about in panel prep, I'm going to say me because this is the perspective I come from, is there are a couple ways to think about this. There's the literalism of telling the literal story of the literal problem, and then there is divorcing input from outcome, and the idea in fandom that when you get a community of people who care about each other because of shared identity, and then put them all in a space where they understand that they're a community that cares about each other because of some aspect of identity, fandom is an identity, then they do cool shit in the world. Like some of my favorite fandoms are John and Hank Green. They're internet personalities. And their fandom has raised $25 million to build a maternal mortality center in Sierra Leone. Their fandom has successfully bullied tuberculosis testing manufacturers to lower their prices internationally. And this doesn't have to do with the content, or most of the content, that John and Hank make. It's very different. We saw like Swifties off of the High of the Eras tour, without prompting from Taylor Swift, go and collectively organize voter registration drives and get out the vote for Kamala Harris. just because they were like, this is a vibe, let's continue the vibe. I love everybody here. What are we doing with this? Where are we putting this energy? We're going to put this energy towards voter registration. And so there is this power because fandom is a tool for building a collective identity through whatever, through mythology, through ensemble casts. And I think that one of the things that I get on a soapbox and talk about a lot is one of the way that fandom develops is time spent over time. This is why I think documentaries struggle a little bit, is because you see something and it's compelling or it's not compelling, and you can either take action immediately or move on, versus when you build relationships over time with content, the way that, like, whatever your favorite show when you were a child or teenager did that you watched for what felt like the rest of your entire childhood, but maybe was 1 to 6 seasons, like that feeling of forever and that feeling like relationship with the content and relationship with the community. So like someone was here saying like one-to-one relating, and I'm like, but also in fandom there's one-to-many relating and many-to-many relating, because at a certain point when fandom breaks containment, it stops being about the thing that they were fans of in the first place and starts being about the community that people are belonging to as a result of their shared love.
I'll say one more thing and then I'll get out of the circle. But to your point that like documentaries and your earlier point about utopias, I think that's the reason that documentaries and dystopias about tech don't really inspire anybody to change, because dystopias just kind of make you depressed. You're like, okay, yeah, that could happen. The Matrix is happening right now. And it kind of draws us inward instead of outward. Whereas, something like Star Trek or even the movie Her, talking about technology where it's not so insidious, but it could be a little bit, like you could imagine it in the near to distant future, work better for inspiring action and inspiring civic imagination, which is something that a fellow colleague of ours in fandom, Henry Jenkins, talks about a lot, is like fandom as inspiration for activism, and collective imagination can inspire us to envision a future that we don't see already.
I feel like that's a perfect segue to why I came to sit down in the circle.
And I'm going to interrupt you real quick. And I can't, because we know each other. It's cool. We're going to hear your comment, Ania, and then we're going to move to a close. So I just want to give us a little heads up that that's what we're going to do, but go for it.
And then I'm also going to preface my thing by saying that I'm going to kick it to you, Meredith, because I'm going to ask you to share something I've heard you talk about before, which is that I think also, we talk about what we want to be true about the future, what we want the future to be like, and then I always think about like what must be true for that to be possible. And I think about that in my job at Omidyar Network in terms of like actual like social and economic infrastructure, like, oh, how do we change clauses in contracts to produce like different results, or how do we create new funds that do things for new purposes. But I also think about the behaviors of people, right? Because there's no magical wand of like corporate structure, entity, legal form that like you do, and then everybody all of a sudden just like is going to be doing the best version of humans. Like you put a human in any utopian vision and then watch what happens. But I feel like one of the things that I've heard you talk about before, Meredith, that I thought was so fascinating, and I also think about a lot in relation to fandoms, is the way that it creates a safe container for people to practice like certain ways of being that they wouldn't normally be able to do in their everyday lives. And I would like really love to hear you talk about that, because I think that that's such an important facet of like, how do we actually get into safe environments where we get to actually practice what we need to be in the future in order to have the one that we want?
Yeah, thank you so much for teeing that up. I'll give you context. I worked on a longitudinal study of fandom about what is universal about fans, no matter what they're a fan of, and it comes down to a few things, one of which is a place to practice emotions. And this is universal, no matter what you're a fan of. You could be a fan of the W, you could be a fan of Black Panther, you could be a fan of anything, and the stories are emotionally compelling that you go through a very human experience in consumption. The practice of being a fan, also, you wind up in a community that knows you have this shared love, can check you if you need to be checked, know that it's happening with love. Fan fiction writers open themselves up to beta readers, and there's an infrastructure for critical feedback of work. And there are whole hosts of containers, and I'm gonna gender this a little bit, but in the dominant form of masculine fandom for the last 2 centuries, which has historically been sports, there's a whole range of human emotions that I don't think the fandom thinks about or talks about in the experience of that consumption and participation of shared loss, of frustration, of immense joy. And that is a place to feel a very human experience. And like, if you were, like, I don't know if anybody's ever been in a story hole where their show ends and then people emerge and are like, what now? Where do I go? And then they can turn to their fellow fans and say, well, you're in this with me. What do I do now? And then take recommendations and migrate through culture in this shared container. And one of the benefits of fandom is you have something to look forward to, and the flip side of that is you have to wait. So it's both excitement and patience, the 2 sides of that coin. And yes, it really is a powerful experience. Did I dive deep enough into what you wanted? I know we had a whole conversation about it at another event.
That's
so
wonderful. So thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to just let you say one quick thing, and then we're going to just, after one quick thing. Okay, great.
Okay, cool. The thing that you guys all talked about, that we talked about, but we've danced around, is how does tech raise that collective fandom? How do we get those stories told? How do we put a spotlight? How do we highlight these stories? Every single one of you talked about stories that you've either produced, created, done, but how are we getting spotlights on it? And what we were just talking about is, because I'm the oldest person in the room, there was this thing called Usenet groups in the old days, and those were very democratized. Everybody, multi-fandoms. What they were talking about, and what my son was part of, was Tumblr. It was pretty democratized. You would have multi-fandoms talking to each other. I don't have an answer, but that was the question I wanted to put back to you is, what is that tech gonna be that allows us to shine a light across fandoms and raise voices?
What indeed? That'll be for the next panel. Thank you so much for that. And I just want to say thank you so much to everyone. I'm going to pass it over to Nicole. We were going to do a lightning round close, but I think we need to, I'm trying to respect the beautiful organizers of the Impact Lounge who have to flip this room before the next panel. But Nicole, I would love for you to segue into particularly the question we had about how do we fund these different kinds of stories?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the Alternative Futures Fund a little bit, guys. Because I feel like I heard themes of how do these stories get made, what moves us and compels us to action. The narrative stories start as mythology, that just like blew my mind, Jason. And then another thing that came up for me was like not focusing so much on the bad that we forget the good and what we're building towards. And so I wanted to talk about the Alternative Futures Fund, which is an initiative that Media Network is launching this year that supports storytellers that are telling a different narrative. So everything that we've discussed today. We have these stories about what's going wrong, about power hoarding, about job insecurity, about creative work that's being scraped without consent, which are all very important things, but we're missing the stories that are showing what we're building towards, like what is possible when we have collective agency over these issues. And so we're funding stories that can make collective power feel sexy and tangible and something that we need to have. And so I would just say, come chat to me afterwards if you're interested. Grab one of these little things. And that's it. I'll hand back over to you, Jocelyn.
Thanks, Nicole. And all I have to say is thank you so much. This was a real experiment for us today, and I really appreciated everyone who stepped in, who took a chance. And I don't know about y'all, but I was loving this. This was fantastic. It was so rich and so different than what it would have been if it was just 3 voices at the front of the room. So thank you so much for coming with us on this journey. If you like what you see and you happen to be in Austin for South by Southwest, our team with the Tech We Want and Media Network will be hosting The Lighthouse at the Belmont in South by Southwest, and we'll be doing more conversations just like this one because we are all about democratizing these conversations and the stories that are helping us build the future where we can all thrive. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your Impact Lounge and Sundance. Thanks, everybody.